So, good afternoon, eLife leaders. So, the title of our message today is Faith Acts and Wins. So, last week we studied about what faith is, and we talked about how Abraham and, well, even from Cain, from Enoch to Noah, and then Abraham and Sarah, these are people of faith. These are men of faith. They live by faith in God during their lifetime. And so, as we continue with the study of chapter 11 of the book of Hebrews, we go into further other characters in the Old Testament as an example of faith, of endurance. So, if you remember, I've been telling you that in the book of Hebrews, the author has been encouraging the believers to stay faithful to the Lord and never give up the on holding on to the confession of the faith, because we have Jesus as the great high priest. Just a quick review of what we have discussed last week. We defined faith as the thing that shows us the reality of what we hope for, and it is the evidence of things not seen. What we were explaining here is that when we have faith, we're not saying that we are leaping in the dark, that we are risking everything for no good reason. Faith has an object, and the object of our faith is God. And if God is reliable, and if Jesus is the great high priest who have gone through what he is asking us to go through with him, and that therefore we can trust God that as we also go through the difficulties of life and aim for heaven, that we will also be victorious just as Jesus has been victorious. And even as the people in the Old Testament, even though they haven't learned the faith in Jesus Christ because they never knew Jesus before, but they prophesied about him, still they walked in faith in God and they were victorious. So he is using the Old Testament characters to encourage the believers to keep to walk also in faith and be victorious. Faith is trusting in God as we go on a mission with him. I have emphasized that this kind of faith is not really about getting salvation. They already had salvation at this time, but making faith at work. Okay, as verse 2 says, through their faith, people in the old days earned a good reputation. Now, what do we mean by this good reputation? If you look at the Greek, it literally means obtained a testimony. The word reputation actually is testimony. So, it is our goal that we should be able to earn a good reputation or a solid testimony or a good track record. Maybe in the modern expression that is clear to you, a good track record. Like as we say it in Tagalog, maganda yung kanyang patotoo. His life has been a good testimony. So the question is, how can we build a good testimony to empower the next generation? Okay, I have again 3 points to share from this passage of scripture. First of all, pass forward your faith. Again, pass forward your faith. We may be remembered for our personal accomplishments, but they are not transferable. That is only kumbaga, credited to us, right? Or attributed to us because we are the ones who work hard for them. But we can pass forward our faith to the next generation. They will also learn to trust God and also win, because that's what we want them to experience as well, right? So the first thing that I'd like to point out here is God's blessings can be received by our children if they learn our faith in God. As much as God has also blessed us, the next generation of believers, the younger generation, should also learn the faith that we had. They need our guidance. They need our mentoring. And the best thing that we can share to them is, of course, our faith in the Lord. Verse 20, it was by faith that Yitzhak promised blessing for the future of to his sons, Yaakov and Esau. It was by faith that Yaakov, when he was old and dying, remember, old and dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and bowed in worship as he leaned on his staff. So the idea here is that both Yitzhak and Jacob were passing on the blessing. So it was not just meant for them that the children will simply enjoy what they have received. No, they too need to learn how to receive God's blessings for them. Okay? Now, normally when you have a successful man, the children benefit from the riches of their father. I remember Shaquille O'Neal, you know that guy, the famous basketball player, retired. He said, many times I would tell my children, we're not rich. I am rich. That's what he would tell his children. He said he's telling his kids to learn how to work hard and earn a success for themselves. Okay? Many rich people would only um, pass on the inheritance to their children only a little. Most of the rich people would pass on majority of their wealth to foundations, to other organizations, because they want their children to learn to work hard, because that's how they earned the good reputation that they have had. Uh, Yitzhak and Yaakov continued to believe in the blessings of God even when they were about to die. And so they empowered their children with them. So remember, Abraham died rich. But Yitzhak had to learn how to walk in faith. And he had also learned how to gain the blessings of God and even wealth because of his walk by faith in the Lord. And the same thing with Jacob. Remember, he had, even though he stole the birthright from his uh, twin brother Esau, he had to flee to Haran and get a wife and raise a family there, and establish his own business. So that's why when he left Haran with his family, with lots of children, and he was bringing lots of riches, Yitzhak was so surprised, and even Esau, who are these people? What are these riches? Be- it's because the Lord has blessed Jacob when he was in Haran. So that's what we're talking about here. Even though the first generation might be successful, the next generation should learn how to be successful by depending upon the Lord, by learning faith for themselves. And that's why it's so important for us that we are able to show them how to live by faith and trusting in God. Number two, our children would be grateful and would honor us for our faith, because that's the very important heirloom that we can share to them. Not really material possessions, but actually the trust in the Lord that they also need to learn. It was by faith that Joseph, when he was about to die, just the same thing with Yitzhak and Jacob, when they were about to die, they blessed their children, said confidently that the people of Israel would leave Egypt. So he was prophesying about the return of his people back to Canaan. He even commanded them to take his bones with them when they left, and that's what exactly they did. Joseph's prophecy about the return to Canaan empowered the people to believe that God's promises to Abraham, which is to inherit the promised land, remains for them. The Lord hasn't forgotten those promises. They were not meant to stay long in Egypt. They were meant to come back to Canaan, because God's promise to their grand ancestor Abraham is to inherit the land of Canaan. So it would be fulfilled in their lifetime. Soon they will be able to take possession of what God has promised to their ancestors. So remember, when we need to pass forward this faith that we have been learning from our walk with the Lord. Now, will our children remember a lot from us, especially the faith that we have had in the Lord? We may not give them a lot of material possessions as an inheritance for them, but what will be our success is when they also adapt the faith that we have been teaching them. Of course, there's no guarantee that they will also um, hold on to the faith that we have passed on to them, but we do hope so. Right? We do hope so. We know many pastors in America, even big, well-known pastors, their children have been known to leave the faith. Okay, so those are sad stories, because their parents were well known as pastors and philosophers. And how could you imagine that even when a lot of people have known the Lord because of their ministry, that their children would actually depart from the faith? It's a sad story. I don't want that to happen to my children, but eventually it's their decision, and I always pray to the Lord for them that they will not depart from the faith. God's blessings can be received by our children if they learn our faith in God, and our children would be grateful and would honor us from our faith. So remember, they brought the bones of Joseph back. That is the way they honored Joseph for his faithfulness. Second, overcome hardships with faith. Most of the times we think of faith as always something positive. That means it will always bring us blessings and positive results. Well, of course, yes. But faith is not only a tool to receiving God's promises, but it is also a tool for overcoming hardships in life. We cannot avoid hardships in life. We should not set our hopes on this world or expect good things from it. We should expect our faith to be severely tested with obstacles, opposition, persecutions, suffering, death threats, and trials, and death. By faith, we can face them and win. So let's look at the several Bible characters who went through a lot of difficult moments, even more difficult than what we have had. Sometimes when we're just lacking of funds, we become so distressed immediately. But imagine these people of God. They have had bad moments in their lives, and still they held on to their faith in the Lord and to Yahweh. Number one, faith overcomes fear of evil authority. So we're talking about bad leaders. It was by faith that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months when he was born. They saw that God had given them an unusual child, okay, because he would be the leader of Israel soon. And they were not afraid to disobey the king's command. Remember the command of the king: kill all young Hebrew boys, children, and they didn't do that. You know what happened to them? They saved him. They put him like in a basket and put him on the river, the basket on the river, and eventually it was picked up by the daughter of the Pharaoh. The question is, do we recognize what God has given to us? The parents recognized that God has given them the future leader of his people. So they did their best to take care of Moses. And that is an act of faith, defying the king's commands. And not only the parents, right? Remember, it was commanded to kill all the young children to the midwives. Okay, it was commanded to the midwives, and because of the fear of God, the midwives did not obey the command of the king. So, do we fear ungodly commands by authorities? I hope not. We are only commanded to disobey authorities when they go against the will of God. That is when the time when civil disobedience is permissible. So we should not fear if it goes against the will of God, because we know that our God is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We are primarily citizens of heaven. It's our citizenship here on earth, like as in the Philippines or whatever your citizenship is secondary to our heavenly citizenship. All right? Number two, faith empowers us to turn away from worldliness and to face a difficult life. Not many Christians are willing to go through difficulties in life, even if it means that most of your life you will have to be struggling with a lot of difficulties. Many believers imagine that even on this earth they will be richly blessed, in a sense that they will live like a very luxurious life, right? You hear oftentimes these kinds of preachings from prosperity preachers. That's not the teachings of the scriptures. Verse 24, it was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of the Pharaoh's daughter. He sacrificed that. Even though he grew up in a privileged way, he was ready to set it aside. He chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin, because he knew he wasn't an Egyptian. He knew that he was a Hebrew. So he identified himself with his fellow Hebrews rather than with the Egyptians, because that's what he really was. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of, sorry, natakpan ko yung verse. Will our faith prepare us and empower us to face oppressions and sufferings and reject worldly pleasures? So take note of what the verses say there. Refused to be called the son of the Pharaoh's daughter, chose, which is the positive side, chose oppression, and he thought of it better to suffer. Now that is quite an unusual choice. Why would someone think, that's his mindset, it's better to suffer for the sake of righteousness? But that should be the Christian mindset. So how will you be able to to take that step of faith. It's simply changing your mindset. Your mindset should be on the Lord. So even if it means suffering, even if it means giving up privileges, even if it means to share in the oppression of God's people, especially a lot of Christians were being persecuted during the time of the writing of the letter to the Hebrews, we should also choose to be identified with our fellow believers, even if they are being persecuted for the faith. It is by faith that empowers us to turn away from worldliness and to face a difficult life. Number three, faith empowers us to move on because Moses knew that he had to leave Egypt. Well, of course, we are given the impression that Moses left Egypt because he was trying to escape. Well, of course, that's part of the reason, because the Egyptians were wanted to take revenge against him. Verse 27, it was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. So, from the perspective of the author of letter to the Hebrews, Moses wasn't really escaping because of fear. He wasn't fearful at all, but because he knew it was time to move on. It was time to leave because he was not even a real Egyptian. He was a Hebrew. So he kept right on going because he kept his eyes on the one who is invisible. Basically, he was thinking of God. He had faith in God. So even when he departed from Egypt, he already had faith in God. So that's why he chose to be oppressed with God's people, because he knew that the God of his people is the real God. The question is, do we have faith to depart when we have to? Moses believed that he had to leave. Imagine that. He could have just humbled himself or pleaded guilty, rather than be away in a worse place. Now, it's like for some people, they are in America, they would rather stay in America and maybe, if they have done something wrong, be imprisoned in America rather than be deported out of America. That kind of a mindset. Yeah. But for Moses, no, I don't mind. Egypt is not the ultimate place for me. God has something better for me. Um, I do understand when Filipino choose to leave for a better life. And if God grants them that opportunity, praise the Lord. It was God's blessing for them. But for those who were not given the privilege of leaving and but rather staying here in the Philippines, if it's God's will, then we have to accept it. If God wants us to sort of to live in this kind of condition, make sure it is for the glory of God. So you can glorify God even if you live in a poorer condition, as long as you have faith in God. Do we have faith to keep on going even when our destination may not be better than where we came from? So eventually he ended up going to Midian. He left Egypt, which was a better place during that time, which was a very powerful nation. But for Abraham, it's fine. I have faith that God is going to take care of me, even if means Midian is the worst place to go. Number four, faith trusts in the salvation of God and judgment on our enemies. It was by faith that Moses commanded the people of Israel to keep the Passover and to sprinkle blood on the doorpost so that the angel of death would not kill their firstborn sons. So Moses was passing on his faith to the people of Israel because it was the time for God to save them. For centuries, they have been suffering under the hands of the new Pharaoh. Okay, during the time of Joseph, they were fine, but when a new Pharaoh who never knew Joseph, uh, they did not respect the Hebrews and they enslaved them. Well, quickly, one of the reasons why that new Pharaoh did not know Joseph is because it was another dynasty. The 18th dynasty by the time of Moses. So it was another dynasty during the time of Joseph. All right. So just when we have suffered enough, just like Israel, the suffering was so much. God said, "That's enough. This is the time for me to rescue Israel." Our God will come to our rescue and end our oppressors. We should be ready to obey and go. So at this time, what we see in the verse, God was ending their suffering. It was their time for salvation, and it was the time to judge God's enemies. Are you ready when that time comes? When God says, "This is the moment that I will end your difficulties in life." Okay, maybe partially, but a major difficulty in your life, and I'll bring you my salvation, a great blessings from me. You'll be free from this person or from this kind of a situation in life. Will you be obey to go and obey what God has told you to do? In this case, they did the Passover ceremony. Number 5, faith will bring us through God's salvation from oppression. It was by faith that the people of Israel went through the Red Sea as though they were on dry ground. So this is the crossing through the sea. But when the Egyptians tried to follow, they were all drowned. We should keep trusting in God when He directs us to go through the impossible. Remember, when they were about facing the Red Sea, they thought that was the dead end. They never knew that God was able to provide a way for them in the most unlikely place, which was the sea. So when we take that step of faith, we will see the miraculous work of God, the salvation of God, only when we have faith. Remember what the other people, the faithless ones, were telling Moses. Why did you bring us to this kind of situation? We should go back to Egypt, right? But Moses encouraged them to keep their faith in the Lord, and so the Lord provided the way through the leadership of Moses. In there, when in that kind of place, we will experience His miracles, right? So faith will lead us to miraculous victory. You won't see God's miracles unless you have faith in Him. Verse 30, it was by faith that the people of Israel marched around Jericho for 7 days, and the walls came crashing down. If they didn't have that kind of faith, they would not have marched around Jericho. Because Jericho was a fortified city. Imagine imagine how vulnerable they were. You know, if you were on a walled city, all you had to do was to put your soldiers on top of the walls and shoot arrows on invaders outside. You would have the tactical advantage of shooting your enemy because you're on top and they're below, right? But you see, they acted in faith. God made a miracle. He destroyed the walls. It was by faith that Rahab, the prostitute, was not destroyed with the people. She was from Jericho. She helped the people of Israel. She turned against her people. Why? With the people in her city who refused to obey God because she believed in the God of the Hebrews. For she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. So when God leads our offense, expect victory. It's like you have a superstar. You have a very reliable offensive player. When he leads your offense, you have faith on your key player, you know you're going to have the victory. But when God is the leader of our offense, we know He'll provide a way for us and we will gain the victory. One more example, or a few more actually. How much more do I need to say? It would take too long to recount the stories of the faith of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and all the prophets. By faith, these people overthrew kingdoms, ruled with justice, and received what God has promised them. So just like these well-known people in the Old Testament, because they were instrumental for the Lord to provide victory for Israel, because these men learned faith. You know, even the story of Samson, he didn't start with faith. He started with doing a lot of bad things in life. Jephthah, he didn't start with faith. Gideon didn't start with faith. But when they encountered God, they learned faith in God. And so God used them and provided victory for the people of Israel. What else? They shut the mouths of lions, probably referring to the experience of Daniel. Quenched the flames of fire, probably referring to the 3 friends of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and escaped death by the edge of the sword. Their weakness was turned to strength. Do you want that to happen to you? Your weakness will become your strength. That will happen when you have faith in God. Whatever that weakness is, that weakness could be, you say, it's so simple. I have a weakness in a certain, if you're a student, in a certain subject. Even if you would say that's a small matter, but that means a lot to you, God can help you out with your weaknesses. How much more with spiritual matters? How much more with greater um, trials that the Lord will give you? It's the same thing. If you have faith in God, whether it's just a matter of weaknesses in learning some things, or a challenge to accomplishing God's mission, it's your faith in God that will help you out. They became strong in battle and put whole armies to flight. Even they were only a few of them, they chased the enemy, even then when they are more than them. Women received their loved ones back to death, from death again. So probably in reference to the story of Elijah and Elisha. Remember, they brought their son back to life. Oops. Okay. Number seven. Number seven. Faith will help us be loyal to God even when there is no miracle. Now, he turns to an example of people who who did not receive miracles from the Lord, but they kept their faith on the Lord. If you'd remember what the friends of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said to the king, they said, even if our God does not rescue us, we will not bow down to your God. They kept their faith in God, even if there's no miracle. It's fine with them because there's still only one true God to whom you should be bowing down. Verse 35 again. But others were tortured, refusing to turn from God in order to be set free. There was no miracle. God allowed them to be tortured. Paul was tortured severely. Okay. They place their hope in a better life after the resurrection. So they know they will ultimately be a miracle for them, the resurrection. Some jeered at, and their backs were cut open with whips. Others were chained in prison. Now, I'm beginning to think that the author of Hebrews is not referring anymore to some characters in the Old Testament. Maybe he's referring to some Christians during their lifetime who have experienced these kinds of maltreatment. Because I don't know some stories in the Old Testament that these things have ever occurred. Anyway, at least testimony from the biblical narrative. When God does not save us from persecution and suffering, we know that we will still experience a great miracle, resurrection. Do you believe that? We will be saved. When Jesus comes back, our bodies He will change, and we shall be forever with Him. Amen? Some died by stoning, just like Stephen. Some were sawed in half. Others were killed with the sword. Some went about wearing skins of sheep and goats, destitute and oppressed and mistreated. They were too good for this world, wandering over deserts and mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground. Now, honestly, I couldn't imagine living this kind of life. But these people were willing to go through it because they know it's where God was leading them. It's really humbling, not really humiliating. People will say that's humiliating, but when in your relationship with God, you would say this is a humbling experience when He allows you or makes you go through this kind of destitute living. With or without miracles, faith holds on to the true God. So that's the real test of faith, right? When God doesn't give you miracles, will you still hold on to God? Well, they will be resurrected soon. Okay, altogether. Actually, we will learn more about that at the end of the message. So, letter B: overcome hardships with faith. Faith overcomes fear of evil authorities. They disregarded the wrong command of the evil command of the evil authorities. Faith empowers us to turn away from worldliness and to face a difficult life. Faith empowers us to move on. When it's time to go, you have to go. Um, Faith trusts in the salvation of God and judgment on our enemies. So they experienced crossing of the Red Sea. Faith will bring us through God's salvation from oppression. Faith will lead us to miraculous victory. And faith will help us to be loyal to God even when there is no miracle. This is the last point. A few two verses to go. Aim for the better promises. Now, the author of Hebrews is about to close this part of his um, theme. Rather than getting things from this world, we should be hoping for God's eternal promises and look forward for our perfection with all our siblings in faith, all at the same time. That will happen simultaneously. On that day, when God finally blesses us with His promise. What do we mean by this? Our ancestors in faith were able to obtain a solid testimony. We too can obtain one. Believe that. Believe that. Now, if you think that you haven't been building a solid testimony, now begin increasing your faith. And so you'll be able to build a solid testimony. Verse 39, all these people earned a good reputation. Remember a while ago I said earned a good reputation means obtaining a testimony because of their faith. Yet none of them received all that God had promised. Why? Because God was reserving it uh, in the end. God had something better in mind for us, so they would not reach perfection without us. Who's the they? The peoples have gone. The people have gone ahead of us. That means, together with Abraham, even Abel, even with Enoch, and all the heroes of faith in the Old Testament, they will be perfected with us. We will reach perfection all at the same time. When you say perfect, the work of God is complete in us. Okay? Our story of faith may have failures, well, certainly. When we attain victory at the end, those failures will not undermine our reputation. It should be not undermine our reputation. What do you mean by reputation? That is the good reputation that we have here in verse 39. Let me go back. We talked about this in chapter 11, verse 2. Through their faith. So this is verse 2. Verse 2. He was just starting here. The people in days of old earned a good reputation. So he's closing with the same words in verse 39. Verse 2 is the second verse of chapter 11. Verse 39 is the second to the last verse of chapter 11. All these people earned a good reputation because of their faith. Because of their faith. They had a solid testimony. They obtained a solid testimony because of their faith. They were faithful to the Lord. Earning a good reputation or obtaining a testimony means completing our mission from God. My question is, how is our progress? How solid is our testimony? Masasabi ba natin we already have a testimony or at least we're having a good testimony by this time? Is the record of our testimony getting better? Work on it if you don't think so. Work on it if people doesn't see your faith yet. Whatever you're going through, use that faith. Now, for many of us older than some of you, we have already reached a certain mileage in our faith. And you may be wondering, will I also be as faithful as him or as these people? Yes, you can, because we had our faith in God. If you put your faith in Him, you will also obtain a solid testimony. Now, verse 39 and 40 talks about the promises of God. Now, we all love promises, right? And we hate promises broken. But God doesn't break His promises. He said, none of them received all that God has promised, which would be the perfection. Okay, so that they would not reach perfection. We will receive perfection all at the same time with them. When we look at the whole book of Hebrews, the word promise has been, I think, used for about more than 10 times. All right. I'll just quote the select verses that we have studied previously in pertaining to the promises. What are these promises? Chapter 4, verse 11 says, God's promise of entering His rest still stands. So this one of the promises that we have to obtain is the rest. And of course, when we come to Christ, we have entered God's rest, so that all who are called can receive eternal inheritance. So referring to a future rest. We already have rest in Christ right now. He is our Sabbath, but we haven't experienced its fullness. That's why we still continue working here on earth, right? but eventually we will receive an eternal inheritance, more than a piece of land in Middle East. That's not for us. That's for Israel. Filipinos, God has given us His this land here in Far East. Okay, they did not receive what was promised. Same thing that what we have here in chapter 11, verse 39. But they saw it from a distance and welcomed it. That's the kind of faith that we need to have. Even if it's not yet here, but we know we're getting closer. And even if we're not yet there, we are welcoming it. It's like it's not just we're coming to it, but it's coming to us, right? And verse 12. Instead, you will follow the example of those who are going to inherit God's promises because of their faith and endurance. I'm sorry, that's not chapter 11, that's chapter 6. Chapter 6, verse 12. Why will they inherit God's promises? Two things: faith and endurance. Do you have those two? Faith and endurance. For young people, life is going to be more difficult. You will experience a lot of difficulties in this world. Don't be surprised. That's part of the that's the part of the challenge we have here on earth. In heaven, we won't experience those things. But if you want to inherit the promise in heaven, you have to pass the test here, the test of faith. Aim for the better promises. Our ancestors in faith were able to obtain a solid testimony. We too can obtain one. Let us be excited to reach that perfection with all people, the faithful people. All right. So let's summarize. Pass forward your faith. It should be a practice. You should be building up your faith so you can pass on some faith to them. If you're not growing in faith, you can't pass anything to them. Overcome hardships with faith, and let your faith be evident during the most difficult times of our lives. Aim for the better promises. Keep your focus on Jesus Christ. That is the thing that we will be talking about next week. You know the opening verses of chapter 12, don't you? Since we're surrounded by great clouds of witnesses. We're talking about the people in chapter 11. So, faith acts and win. You use your faith and you will win.